The first sign wasn't a betrayal. It was a calendar invite. I noticed it on a Monday morning in late February, the kind of gray Midwestern winter day where everything feels paused, but tense, like the air is holding its breath. I was standing in my kitchen in Milwaukee, coffee going cold on the counter, scrolling through my phone before heading out to work. Family Strategy Meeting. Private, that was the title. Scheduled for that afternoon. Location, my parents' house. Attendees, my mother Linda, my stepfather George, my younger sister Hannah, and my cousin Mark. My name wasn't on it. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. That's what I always did. I filled in gaps for other people. I smoothed over silences. I explained away exclusions before they had to. But something in my chest tightened in a way that felt familiar. The feeling of being quietly moved out of the frame. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 33 years old then. I worked as a compliance manager for a regional construction firm. The kind of job that exists because people cut corners when they think no one is watching. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, but I was precise, and I was good at what I did. I lived alone, paid my own bills, had never asked my family for money, ever. They like to call that independence. I had learned, over time, that independence was their favorite excuse. I didn't text anyone about the meeting. I didn't ask why I wasn't included. I didn't do what I used to do, which was offer myself back into rooms I had been quietly removed from. Instead, I took a screenshot. Then I went to work. All day, my phone stayed silent. No one reached out to explain. No one asked if I was available. No one checked whether I wanted to attend. That told me everything I needed to know. My mother remarried when I was 22. My biological father had died suddenly years earlier, and George came into our lives slowly, carefully, like someone who understood how fragile grief could be. He was calm, practical, and very good with money. He also had opinions about hierarchy. Hannah, my sister, was 7 years younger than me. She had always been described as sensitive, creative, needing support. I had been described as capable. Those labels stuck. When my mother inherited my grandmother's lakefront property 5 years earlier, it was discussed openly at Thanksgiving. Everyone around the table, everyone included. The plan, supposedly, was simple. The property would remain in the family. One day, it would be sold and divided fairly. That was the story. The meeting I wasn't invited to rewrote it. I found out 3 days later, accidentally. Hannah called me, her voice too bright. "You're not mad, right?" she asked. "About what?" I said. A pause. "They're transferring the lake house into an LLC," she said. "George thinks it's smarter for taxes." "And?" I asked. "And it'll be under my name," she said quickly. "Just on paper. It doesn't mean anything." There it was. Just on paper. The phrase people use when they want you not to notice that paper is where power lives. "Why your name?" I asked. "Well," she said, "you're established. You don't need it. I'm still figuring things out." I closed my eyes. There was no anger in my voice when I replied. Just clarity. "Did Mom ask if I was okay with that?" Another pause. "No," she said. "But it's not personal." Of course it wasn't. Nothing ever was. I drove to my parents' house that evening. Not to confront, to observe. The lights were on. Cars in the driveway. The meeting was still happening. I sat in my car across the street and watched silhouettes move behind the windows. People I loved. People making decisions about me, without me. I didn't knock. I didn't interrupt. I went home instead and opened my laptop. I searched property records. The transfer paperwork had already been drafted. They weren't planning. They were executing. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. This wasn't about the lake house. It was about who was allowed to decide. And I had just been formally excluded. I printed the records, placed them in a folder, and set it on my desk. Not as evidence, as orientation. Because once you realize you are no longer part of the conversation, you stop trying to be heard. You start preparing to act. And that was the night my silence stopped being passive and became deliberate. Silence has a weight to it. Once you stop filling it for other people, they begin to notice. Not immediately. At first, they enjoy the space, the lack of resistance, the assumption that everything is fine. That's what happened after the lake house transfer. No one called to explain further. No follow-up. No check-in. The paperwork moved forward with the quiet confidence of people who had done this before. I let it. At work, I kept my head down. A compliance audit was underway for a mid-size contractor who had been inflating safety reports. My team uncovered inconsistencies that suggested long-term manipulation, not a clerical error. I compiled timelines, cross-checked signatures, and flagged the report for legal review. I noticed how calm I felt. Patterns are easier to see when you stop personalizing them. 2 weeks later, Hannah posted a photo on social media. The lake in early spring. The caption read, "So grateful for family who supports me." My phone buzzed with messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. "Congratulations! So happy for Hannah. You must be proud." I replied to none of them. Instead, I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. Her name was Patricia O'Neill, late 50s, former probate judge turned private practice. She didn't waste time. "I'm not here to fight my family," I told her. "I want to understand my position." She nodded. "That's the right place to start." I laid out the situation. The inheritance history, the sudden transfer, the meeting I wasn't invited to. She listened without interruption. "They're using proximity as justification," she said finally. "You're stable, she's dependent. It's a common pattern." "Is it legal?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "Which doesn't mean it's fair." I expected anger to follow that sentence. It didn't. "What are my options?" I asked. "Legally," she said, "limited. Strategically, broader." She leaned forward. "Do you want inclusion or leverage?" The question surprised me. "I want agency," I said after a moment. She smiled slightly. "Then stop reacting and start documenting." That word again. Documenting. At home, my mother finally called. "I heard you were upset," she said. "I wasn't informed," I replied. "There's a difference." "We didn't think you'd want the responsibility," she said. "You have your life together." There it was again. The compliment that erased choice. "Did you consider asking?" I said. A pause. George's voice in the background, muffled, directional. "Evelyn," my mother said, softer now. "This is about keeping things simple." "For whom?" I asked. She didn't answer. That night, I opened a new folder on my computer. I titled it February. I saved the calendar invite screenshot. The property draft. The text messages. Hannah's social media post. Not for revenge, for clarity. The next escalation came quietly. George emailed me a revised family financial overview. It was framed as transparency, a courtesy. I noticed something missing. My name. Under beneficiaries. Under long-term planning. Under contingencies. I was no longer listed. Not removed. Omitted. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Patricia. She responded within the hour. "They're restructuring future expectations," she wrote, without opposition. I sat back in my chair and laughed once. Not humor, recognition. At Sunday dinner that week, I attended as usual. I brought wine, complimented the food, listened more than I spoke. Hannah talked about plans for renovations at the lake house. New dock, new windows. "George says it'll be good for resale value," she said. "Are you planning to sell?" I asked casually. "No," she said quickly. "I mean, maybe someday." My mother avoided my eyes. That was when I stopped eating. Not in protest, in resolve. When I left, George hugged me longer than necessary. "You know this doesn't change anything between us," he said. "It changes the structure," I replied. "And structures shape outcomes." He smiled tightly, always the compliance officer. That night, Patricia and I spoke again. "They've created an imbalance," she said. "The question is whether you intend to remain inside it." "No," I said. "Then your next move shouldn't be emotional," she replied. "It should be quiet." I looked at the printed documents on my desk. For the first time, I wasn't wondering how to fix the family. I was wondering how to protect myself. And that shift changed everything. The thing about being the reasonable one is that people rely on it. They assume your silence is agreement. Your distance is maturity. Your restraint is loyalty. They don't notice the moment when reason turns into assessment. I didn't change my behavior after Sunday dinner. That was intentional. Change invites scrutiny. Consistency invites complacency. At work, the audit I'd flagged escalated. Legal requested a full internal review. I spent long hours reconstructing timelines, matching invoices to site reports, tracing responsibility through layers of polite deflection. The contractor's leadership tried to charm their way out of it at first. Then they tried pressure. Neither worked. I wasn't emotional. I was thorough. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing exactly where the line is and watching others realize they've crossed it. That same calm followed me home. A week later, I received an email from my mother with a subject line, "Quick question." She asked if I would be willing to sign a document, just to acknowledge the LLC structure, she wrote. "Nothing changes for you." I read the attachment slowly. It was a consent form, not required legally, optional, but useful. It would formalize that I had no claim now or later. It would protect Hannah's position completely. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Patricia. "They want you to validate the exclusion," she said after reading it, "so they can tell themselves you agreed." "I didn't," I said. "No," she replied, "and you don't have to." "What happens if I don't sign?" I asked. "They'll be uncomfortable," she said. "That's all." I smiled faintly. Discomfort was not a reason to compromise my future. That evening, Hannah showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked nervous, overdressed, like someone preparing for a confrontation she hoped wouldn't happen. "I just wanted to talk," she said. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat on the edge of my couch, clutching her phone. "They're stressed," she said. "Mom's worried you're upset." "I'm aware," I replied. "You could just sign it," she said quickly. "It's not like you want the house." I studied her. "Did you want the house?" I asked. She hesitated. "I didn't think I'd get it." "But you accepted it," I said. "Yes," she said, "because it made sense." "For you," I replied. She looked up at me then, something flickering in her expression. "You always make everything complicated," she said. "Why can't you just let it go?" There it was. The cost of my boundaries, spoken plainly. "I did let it go," I said calmly. "They didn't." She stood abruptly. "You're acting like a victim." "No," I said. "I'm acting like someone who noticed." She left without saying goodbye. The next day, George called, not to ask how I was, to explain. "Your sister needs stability," he said. "You're resilient." "You keep confusing traits with consent," I replied. He sighed. "This isn't personal." "It is," I said. "You just don't want to name it." He didn't argue. After we hung up, I opened the February folder again. I added notes, dates, phrases, patterns. At the end of the week, Patricia asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Have you considered disengaging financially altogether?" she asked. "What do you mean?" I said. "Removing yourself from future expectations," she replied. "No inheritance assumptions, no shared assets, no entanglements." The idea landed, quietly but firmly. "I thought that was already happening," I said. "Not formally," she replied. "Right now, you're excluded without closure. That's destabilizing." "What would closure look like?" I asked. She leaned back. "You choosing your own terms." That night, I drafted a letter. Not angry, not defensive. Clear. I stated that I would not be signing the consent document, that I acknowledged the transfer, that I expected no future involvement in property decisions tied to the lake house or any related assets, and that any further communication regarding financial restructuring should be directed through legal counsel. I didn't accuse, I defined. I sent it to my mother and George. Hannah was not included. The response came 2 days later. My mother wrote back first. "This feels extreme," she said. George followed. "We're disappointed you're creating distance." I didn't reply. Instead, I met Patricia in person. We discussed a trust disclaimer, a legal instrument that would formally remove me from future inheritance claims related to my mother's estate. It would protect me. It would also protect them. It would force the reality into daylight. "You understand what this signals," Patricia said. "Yes," I replied. "That I'm done being managed." She nodded. "Once you file this, the family dynamic changes permanently." "I know," I said. I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon. Not the final filing, just the preparation. The weight I felt wasn't fear, it was relief. That weekend, my mother called again. Her voice was strained. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "We never meant to hurt you." "I believe that," I said. "But intention doesn't override impact." She was quiet. "I didn't realize you felt so separate," she said. "I didn't realize you were comfortable making decisions for me," I replied. That conversation ended without resolution. And that was the point. Because the next step wasn't about being understood. It was about choosing whether I would remain available to a system that benefited from my silence. I already knew the answer. The question now was how far they were willing to go once they realized I was no longer playing my role. Once you step out of a role, the system that depended on it begins to strain. I felt that strain almost immediately. The first sign was urgency. Messages that arrived faster than before, shorter, less careful. The politeness thinned. George emailed, asking to clear the air. My mother left a voicemail that ended with, "We're running out of time to finalize things." Hannah sent a text that simply said, "This is getting blown out of proportion." None of them asked what I needed. They asked when I would comply. I didn't respond. Instead, I finalized the disclaimer paperwork with Patricia. We reviewed every clause slowly. The language was neutral, almost sterile, but the effect was anything but. It would formally state that I relinquished any claim to assets tied to my mother's estate, present or future, including, but not limited to, the lake property and any entities formed to manage it. It would also remove me from liability. That part mattered more than they realized. "You don't have to file this immediately," Patricia said. "Once it's drafted, you can hold it." "I know," I replied, "but I don't want leverage. I want closure." She studied me for a moment. People rarely choose closure when leverage is available. "I'm not interested in power over them," I said. "I'm interested in freedom from the dynamic." She nodded once. "Then you're ready." The following week, I attended a family birthday dinner for my uncle. Neutral ground, public enough to discourage scenes. George arrived late. Hannah avoided my side of the table. My mother watched me with a careful attentiveness that felt new and uncomfortable. Halfway through dinner, George leaned toward me. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "About what?" I asked. "You know what." "I don't," I replied evenly. "You'll have to be specific." He frowned. "This letter, the lawyer, it feels like escalation." "It's definition," I said. "You escalated when you removed me from decisions." "That's not fair," my mother interjected softly. I turned to her. "Was I consulted?" She hesitated. That was answer enough. Hannah put down her fork. "Why are you doing this in front of everyone?" she snapped. "I'm not," I replied. "You are." The table went quiet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply finished my meal. After dinner, my cousin Mark cornered me near the door. "They think you're trying to punish them," he said. "I'm not responsible for their interpretations," I replied. "Well, what do you want?" he asked. I looked at him. "I want my decisions to stop being treated as reactions," I said. "That's all." He nodded slowly, like someone recalibrating. 2 days later, my mother showed up at my apartment. No warning, no call. She looked tired. Not emotional, just worn down by a tension she hadn't anticipated. "I don't understand why this has to be legal," she said, sitting at my kitchen table. "Because the exclusion was," I replied. "We didn't exclude you," she said quickly. "We just prioritized Hannah." I poured tea and sat across from her. "You made a decision that affected my future without my consent," I said. "That's exclusion." She shook her head. "You're reading intent where there was none." "I'm reading outcome," I replied. "Intent is irrelevant when you don't carry the consequences." She stared at her hands. "I thought being calm would keep us together," she said quietly. "It kept things quiet," I said. "Not whole." She looked up. "If you file that disclaimer, it's final." "Yes," I said. "You'd really give up everything?" she asked. I thought of the lake. Summers. Childhood memories that had already been repackaged into someone else's future. "I already have," I replied. "I just haven't acknowledged it formally." She didn't cry. She nodded once, like someone accepting a diagnosis. "I didn't know how to include you without losing balance," she said. "You confused balance with control," I replied. "They're not the same." When she left, my apartment felt quieter than usual. Not emptier. Cleaner. That night, Hannah called. Her tone was different. Less sharp. More uncertain. "They're scared," she said. "They think you're cutting us off." "I'm cutting myself loose," I replied. "There's a difference." "You don't have to go nuclear," she said. "This isn't nuclear," I replied. "It's procedural." She laughed bitterly. "You always talk like that, like feelings or paperwork." "No," I said. "I talk like someone who learned that paperwork outlasts feelings." There was a long silence. "Are you really okay with this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She didn't respond. The next morning, I filed the disclaimer. I signed my name slowly, carefully, like someone closing a door without slamming it. Patricia submitted it that afternoon. By evening, my phone was full. Missed calls, messages, voicemails, layered with confusion and disbelief. I listened to none of them. Instead, I went for a walk along the river near my apartment. The water was high from early spring melt, moving fast, carrying debris without hesitation. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The next escalation came not from my family, but from work. The contractor audit I'd led triggered a broader investigation. Executives were being interviewed. Lawyers were circling. The company's board requested my presence at a closed session. As I sat in that room, answering questions calmly, I realized something that surprised me. I trusted myself completely, not because I had all the answers, but because I was no longer splitting my energy between managing systems and managing people's expectations of who I was supposed to be. That clarity sharpened everything. When I got home, there was an email from George. Subject line, reconsider. I didn't open it. I already knew what it would say. What they didn't know yet was that the disclaimer had done more than close a door. It had removed their final assumption that no matter what they decided, I would still be available to absorb the fallout. They were about to learn what happens when the quiet one stops cushioning the impact. The first consequence didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with confusion. 2 weeks after the disclaimer was filed, my mother called again. Not emotional, not angry, just unsettled. The attorney says you're no longer listed anywhere, she said. Not as beneficiary, not as contingency. That's correct, I replied. I didn't realize it worked like that, she said. It works exactly like it's written, I said. That's why people use it. There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine her sitting at the dining table, papers spread out, trying to understand how something so quiet could feel so final. So what happens now? She asked. For me, I said. Nothing changes. For you, you'll have to be intentional. She didn't like that answer. What she wanted was reassurance. That I would still show up. That holidays would still feel the same. That the structure could remain intact, even if I removed myself from its foundation. What she didn't understand yet was that structures don't survive when the load-bearing parts step away. At work, the investigation expanded beyond the contractor I'd flagged. Regulators began reviewing internal oversight processes across multiple projects. My firm's executive team realized they needed someone neutral, methodical, and legally fluent to lead a compliance overhaul. They offered me the role. Director level, more authority, direct access to the board. It was the first promotion I hadn't had to explain myself into. I accepted without celebration. That night, Hannah showed up again. This time, she didn't knock. She rang the bell twice, impatient. You blindsided us, she said the moment I opened the door. I informed you, I replied. You just didn't expect me to follow through. She paced my living room like someone looking for a lever. Mom is a mess, she said. George is furious. They think you did this to punish us. I did it to define myself, I said. You could have just talked to us, she snapped. I did, I said. You decided it wasn't necessary to listen. She stopped pacing. So that's it? She asked. You're just done? No, I replied. I'm just no longer adjustable. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. You always used to compromise, she said. I used to disappear, I replied. There's a difference. She laughed, sharp and humorless. Enjoy your principles, she said. They won't keep you warm. I watched her leave without responding, because she was wrong. Principles don't keep you warm, but they do keep you from freezing in place. The next development came from an unexpected direction. My cousin Mark called, not to mediate, not to pressure, to ask a question. Did you know the LLC can't refinance without unanimous consent? He asked. I do now, I said. They assumed you'd sign, he said. They didn't plan for this. There it was, the first crack. The lake house renovations Hannah had started required financing. The bank needed clarity. The structure they'd rushed through without me now required my absence to be accounted for. Are you going to help them? Mark asked carefully. No, I replied. Why not? He asked. Because my help was never requested when it mattered, I said. Only when it became inconvenient. He exhaled slowly. They thought you'd come around, he said. I already did, I replied. Just not in the direction they expected. That evening, George emailed again. This time, the tone had changed. He wanted a meeting. Not to explain, to negotiate. I agreed, on one condition, that Patricia be present. The meeting took place in a conference room at her office. Neutral ground, clean lines, no family photos to soften the edges. George looked older than I remembered. Not physically, structurally. Like someone who had built a system assuming certain behaviors and was now watching it wobble. This wasn't meant to exclude you, he said. But it did, I replied. We need flexibility, he said. Your disclaimer complicates things. That's what clarity does, I said. My mother sat quietly beside him, hands folded. What would it take for you to withdraw it? George asked. Patricia looked at me but didn't intervene. There's nothing to withdraw, I said. It's done. You're being rigid, he said. I'm being consistent, I replied. My mother finally spoke. We never thought you'd leave the table, she said softly. You kept moving my chair, I replied. Silence filled the room. What do you want from us? She asked. I thought carefully before answering. I want you to stop assuming access, I said. To stop making decisions that require my compliance after the fact. George frowned. That's not how families work. That's exactly how unhealthy ones do, I replied. He leaned back, frustrated. So you're just out? He said. I'm adjacent, I replied. By choice. The meeting ended without agreement, but something had shifted. They no longer spoke as if I would eventually fall back into line. They spoke as if I were a separate entity. At home, I sat at my desk and reviewed the month, the disclaimer, the promotion, the negotiation attempt. None of it felt like revenge. It felt like rebalancing gravity. The system that had relied on my silence now had to carry its own weight, and it was struggling. The next escalation wouldn't be financial. It would be emotional. Because once people realize they can't control outcomes, they try to control narratives. And I was about to hear mine, rewritten. The story they began telling about me didn't start loudly. It started sideways. A relative stopped returning texts. An aunt posted something vague on social media about family values and respect. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me, asking if I was doing okay, in a tone that implied concern, but carried judgment underneath it. The narrative was forming. I was difficult, cold, legalistic. The one who made things complicated when everyone else just wanted peace. I didn't correct it. People who rewrite stories don't listen to edits. At work, the contrast was striking. The board trusted me with authority. Contractors treated my requests with urgency. Regulators appreciated the transparency of our compliance overhaul. In one environment, boundaries increased respect. In the other, they threatened comfort. That distinction clarified everything. My mother invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. Neutral territory. A cafe near the river. She arrived early. I arrived on time. I feel like I'm losing you, she said, before the menus were even set down. I'm not leaving, I replied. I'm just not shrinking anymore. She pressed her lips together. They think you're punishing Hannah, she said. I'm refusing to protect her from consequences, I replied. That sounds harsh, she said. It's accurate, I said. She sighed. She's overwhelmed. She accepted ownership, I replied. Overwhelm is part of that. My mother looked tired. I tried to keep everyone calm, she said. You kept everyone quiet, I replied. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, like someone hearing a truth they couldn't argue with, but weren't ready to absorb. Later that week, Hannah texted. Not anger, panic. They're saying I might have to sell, she wrote. I didn't respond immediately. When I did, it was one sentence. Ownership includes risk. She didn't reply. At work, the compliance overhaul triggered a wave of internal resignations. Managers who had relied on gray areas found themselves exposed. I was invited into meetings that had once been closed to me. I listened. I documented. I enforced. I noticed something important. No one called me cold there. They called me fair. That weekend, a family gathering took place without me. I knew because the photos appeared online. Smiles, group shots, a caption about keeping things together. I felt no urge to comment. Exclusion no longer hurt once I stopped trying to earn inclusion. The next call came from George. This time, There was no attempt at negotiation. "We need your help," he said bluntly. "With what?" I asked. "The refinancing fell through," he said. "They want additional guarantors." "I'm not one," I replied. "They're nervous," he said. "You're destabilizing things." I paused. "I didn't destabilize anything," I said. "I stopped stabilizing it for you." He didn't respond immediately. "You always did that," he said finally. "Absorbed tension so the rest of us didn't have to." "Yes," I replied. "And you took that as my role, not my choice." Silence again. "Are you enjoying this?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I'm done explaining." He hung up. That night, I received a message from Patricia. "They're asking whether there's any way to contest the disclaimer," she wrote. "Is there?" I asked. "No," she replied. "They're looking for leverage." I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a long moment. I thought about my father, how he used to tell me that fairness was about balance, that sometimes one person carried more so others could move forward. He had meant it as wisdom. What he hadn't understood was how easily that philosophy could be weaponized. At the end of the month, my mother sent one last message that cut deeper than the others. "I don't recognize you anymore," she wrote. I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "You never really saw me when I was accommodating either." There was no response. The fallout continued. Hannah struggled. The renovations paused. The family group chats became quieter, more fragmented. And through it all, I stayed steady. I didn't gloat. I didn't lecture. I let the consequences speak. Because the truth was this: I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving. And for a system built on unspoken extraction, that was catastrophic. The next chapter wouldn't be about their reaction. It would be about what I did with the space I'd created. Space can feel dangerous if you've never been allowed to occupy it fully. Once the noise faded, once the messages slowed, and the emotional weather settled into something like resignation, I was left with room. Evenings without obligation, weekends without rehearsed conversations, a calendar that belonged to me. I didn't fill it immediately. That was intentional. At work, my promotion came with expectations. I was now responsible for reshaping compliance culture across 3 regions. Not just policies, but behavior. I traveled more, sat in rooms where people spoke carefully because they knew I was listening for what wasn't said. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years translating silence at home. Now, I was paid to do it professionally. One evening in early summer, I met a woman named Claire Jensen at a regional conference in Chicago. She worked in risk assessment for a healthcare system and had the same measured way of speaking that signaled experience earned, not borrowed. Over coffee, we talked about systems, not families, not feelings, just structure. "People think compliance is about rules," she said. "It's about incentives." "That's true everywhere," I replied. She smiled. "Including families." The comment surprised me. "Especially families," she added. "They just pretend it's love." We exchanged cards, nothing more. That weekend, I received an invitation to my mother's birthday dinner. Neutral wording, polite, no mention of the past months. I considered declining. Then, I accepted. Not out of obligation, out of curiosity. The dinner was subdued, smaller than usual, fewer relatives. No speeches. Hannah sat across from me. She looked tired. Not angry, just strained. "I didn't realize how complicated this would be," she said quietly at one point. "I did," I replied. She nodded, like someone acknowledging a truth they'd avoided. "I thought they'd help more," she said. "They helped until it required them to adjust," I replied. My mother watched us closely, but didn't intervene. George barely spoke. At the end of the night, my mother hugged me longer than usual. "You don't feel far," she said. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm just not available for the same things." She didn't push. That was new. At work, Claire reached out. She was building an internal review framework and wanted a second set of eyes. We met again. Then again. There was no rush, no narrative, just respect. The contrast was instructive. Around that time, the lake house officially went on the market, not publicly. Quiet listing. I found out through Mark. "They can't sustain it," he said. "The costs, the pressure." "I understand," I replied. "Do you want it?" he asked carefully. "No," I said. "That chapter is closed." He hesitated. "They thought you might." "They still think in terms of access," I said. "I think in terms of choice." The sale finalized 2 months later. I wasn't mentioned. That was fine. With the proceeds, the family stabilized temporarily. Debt settled, tension eased, but something fundamental had shifted. They now understood that I would not be reinserted to solve problems I hadn't created. That realization aged them. Meanwhile, my life expanded quietly. Claire and I grew closer. Slowly. Thoughtfully. Two people who had learned the cost of assumption. She never asked about my family unless I brought it up. When I did, she listened without commentary. That felt radical. One night, as we sat on my balcony watching the city dim, she asked a question no one else had. "Do you miss who you were before this?" she asked. I considered it. "No," I said. "I miss who I thought I was allowed to be." She nodded. "That's honest." As summer turned, my mother sent me a message. "We sold the house," she wrote. "I wanted you to hear it from me." "Thank you for telling me," I replied. There was no bitterness in me, just distance, held gently. The truth was, the house had never been the point. The point was that they had made a decision that removed me from my own future and expected me to be grateful for the relief. Now they were learning what it meant to live with the outcomes of that choice, and I was learning what it meant to build something without waiting for permission. The final turning point wouldn't be dramatic. It would be subtle, because the deepest shifts always are. By the time fall arrived, the quiet felt earned. Not the kind that follows avoidance or denial, but the steady silence that comes after decisions have settled into place. My calendar had rhythm now. Work travel, long walks, evenings that didn't require emotional preparation. I noticed how my body responded. My shoulders no longer stayed tense by default. I slept through the night. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head that never actually happened. That alone told me I'd chosen correctly. At work, the compliance overhaul reached its final phase. We presented findings to regulators and received something rare: approval without amendment. The board thanked me, offered a retention bonus, asked about my long-term plans. I didn't rush to answer, because for the first time, planning didn't feel like defense. It felt like authorship. Claire moved into my life gradually, not physically at first, emotionally. She respected pace, asked consent, waited for responses without filling the space. One evening, she said something that landed deeply. "You don't explain yourself unless it's necessary," she said. "That tells me you've already done the work." I smiled. It wasn't optional. She understood. My mother invited me to Thanksgiving, just me. No expectations. No agenda. I went. The table was smaller, the meal simpler. No speeches. George thanked me for coming. That was all. Later, as we washed dishes together, my mother said quietly, "I think I confused closeness with access." I handed her a towel. Most people do. She nodded. "I'm trying to learn the difference." I believed her. Hannah arrived later, not for dinner, for dessert. She looked different, quieter, less certain. "I'm moving," she said. "Where?" I asked. "Out of state," she replied. "A job, something that's mine." I nodded. "That sounds good." She hesitated. "I'm sorry." I didn't ask for clarification. "I know," I said. We didn't hug, but we didn't need to. In December, Claire and I spent Christmas quietly. No family obligations, no performances. She asked if I wanted to talk about my past. I declined. Not because it hurt, because it no longer defined the present. That, more than anything, felt like closure. At the end of the year, Patricia emailed. "I wanted to let you know," she wrote. "Your file is one I think about often. You did something rare." I called her. "What's that?" I asked. "You ended a pattern without destroying yourself or anyone else," she said. "Most people confuse those." I thanked her. That night, I looked through the February folder one last time. The calendar invite, the paperwork, the messages. Then I archived it. Not deleted, archived, because memory doesn't need constant access to stay valid. The next year began without drama. No sudden revelations, no reversals, just continuity. And that, I realized, was the most unexpected outcome of all. The revenge everyone expects is loud. Mine was quiet. It was choosing myself and watching the world adjust accordingly. People assume that once things calm down, the story is over. What they don't understand is that calm is often just the surface layer. Underneath it, consequences are still unfolding. reshaping relationships in ways that can't be undone. By January, the compliance overhaul had become the new standard across the company. What began as damage control was now a template. Other firms started asking for our framework. My name came up in conversations I wasn't in, rooms I didn't attend. That used to bother me. Now, it didn't. Recognition without intrusion felt like the right balance. One afternoon, I received an email from a recruiter representing a national firm. The offer was significant. More money, more visibility, more travel, more exposure. I didn't respond immediately, because ambition without alignment is just another form of pressure. That same week, my mother called again. Her voice was steadier than it had been months earlier. "We're updating our wills," she said. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it elsewhere." I appreciated that. "Okay," I said. "There's a clause," she continued, "about mediation, in case of disputes." "That's wise," I replied. She hesitated. "Your name isn't included." "I know," I said. This time, the silence wasn't heavy. It was clean. "I hope you understand," she said. "I do," I replied. "And I'm glad you're being intentional." She exhaled. "I wish we had done that sooner." "I know," I said. After the call, I sat with the feeling longer than expected. Not sadness, finality. Later that month, Hannah sent me an email. Not a text, an email. She wrote about her move, her job, the relief of starting over somewhere no one expected her to be anything specific. "I didn't realize how much I relied on everyone else's expectations," she wrote. "I'm learning," I replied once. "I hope you find what's yours." We didn't rebuild, but we recalibrated. At work, the board asked me to present at a national conference. Compliance, ethics, governance. I almost declined. Then I accepted. Not for validation, for influence. The talk was well received. Afterwards, a woman in her late 50s approached me. "You spoke about accountability like it was personal," she said. "It is," I replied. She smiled. That's why it worked. That evening, Claire and I talked about the future. Not plans. Values. "What does success look like to you now?" she asked. I thought about it carefully. "Not having to negotiate my place," I said. "Anywhere." She nodded. "That's clear." Spring arrived quietly. No financial entanglements, just distance that had settled into something neutral. One Sunday afternoon, I walked past the river, where I'd gone after filing the disclaimer months earlier. The water was calmer now, lower, clearer. I thought about how quickly everything had escalated back then, how dramatic it felt, how permanent, and how, in the end, the most lasting change hadn't been the paperwork or the conversations. It had been internal. I no longer anticipated reactions. I no longer explained myself in advance. I no longer stayed available to systems that required my silence to function. That realization didn't feel like revenge. It felt like adulthood, fully claimed. The final stretch wasn't about confrontation. It was about integration, taking everything I'd learned and letting it inform how I lived, not just how I responded. The story wasn't ending yet, but it had stopped controlling me, and that made all the difference. The hardest part about reclaiming your life isn't the moment you leave. It's learning how to live without bracing for retaliation. By early summer, nothing dramatic had happened in months. No angry calls, no surprise demands, no emotional emergencies disguised as family concern. That absence felt unfamiliar, like a muscle no longer being used. At first, I waited for something to break. Then I realized nothing was coming. At work, the national firm followed up. A formal offer this time. Leadership role. Authority without ambiguity. The kind of position people spend years angling toward. I took a weekend to think, not because I was afraid of success, because I no longer accepted momentum as a reason. I met Claire for breakfast on Sunday. No agenda. Just eggs, coffee, sunlight spilling across the table. "What are you actually weighing?" she asked. "Whether this moves me closer to the life I'm building," I said, "or just looks impressive from the outside." She smiled. "That's a very different question than most people ask." On Monday morning, I declined the offer. Not emotionally, not defensively, politely. Fine. The recruiter sounded stunned. "Most people don't walk away from this," he said. "I'm not walking away," I replied. "I'm staying where I chose to be." At home, my mother sent a message later that week. "George wants to know if you'd consider family counseling." I read it once, then twice. Then I called her. I'm not against counseling, I said, but I'm done participating in processes meant to restore access. She was quiet. That's not what this would be, she said. Then what would it be? I asked. She didn't have an answer. Let's not force a repair, I said gently. Let's let things be honest first. She agreed. That, too, was new. At work, I began mentoring 2 junior managers, women who reminded me of myself before I learned how much of my energy had been spent managing perceptions. One afternoon, one of them asked, "How did you get people to take you seriously?" I didn't answer right away. By taking myself seriously first, I said finally, and letting the rest adjust. That advice felt earned. In July, Hannah visited briefly before moving again. She asked to meet for coffee, not to talk about the past, to talk about her future. I'm scared, she admitted, but it feels like my fear now. I nodded. That's the difference. When she left, she hugged me. Brief, uncomplicated. I didn't feel the need to hold on. Later that month, George sent a short email. No defense, no explanation, just a thank you. For being clear, he wrote, even when it was uncomfortable. I didn't reply. Gratitude doesn't require reciprocity. That summer, Claire and I traveled together for the first time. No family visits, no compromises, just movement. In a quiet hotel room one night, she said something that stayed with me. You don't live like someone escaping anymore, she said. You live like someone arriving. That was true. By fall, the clinic Patricia had once connected me to asked if I'd consider joining their advisory board. Not as a representative, as an independent voice. I accepted. Not because it was flattering, because it was aligned. One evening, walking home under early autumn light, I thought about the version of myself who once believed love required endurance, silence, and flexibility. She had survived, but she hadn't lived fully. I had, and that wasn't because anyone gave me permission. It was because I stopped waiting for it. The final reckoning wouldn't come from them. It would come from how completely I'd stepped into my own authority. And that was already done. There's a moment that comes after stability, when you realize you're no longer recovering. You're choosing. That realization arrived for me in late October, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, as I stood in my kitchen deciding whether to travel for work the following week. The choice wasn't loaded. No one was pressuring me. No consequences loomed. I noticed how unfamiliar that felt. For most of my adult life, decisions had been reactive. Adjustments made to accommodate someone else's urgency, someone else's comfort, someone else's definition of family harmony. Even success had often come wrapped in justification. Now there was space between stimulus and response. And in that space, I could hear myself think. At work, the board asked me to lead a long-term ethics initiative. Not a task force, a structural shift. Something that would outlast individual leadership changes. I said yes, without hesitation. Not because I needed the role, because I believed in the outcome. That difference mattered. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I received an unexpected voicemail from my mother. Not emotional, not tentative, reflective. I've been thinking, she said, about how often I asked you to be the steady one. I don't think I ever asked what it cost you. I didn't call back immediately. Some realizations need room to breathe. When I did return the call, I didn't reassure her. I didn't minimize. I paid it quietly, I said, because that's what I was taught to do. She didn't argue. I'm sorry, she said. Not in a way that fixes anything, just honestly. That apology landed differently than others had. It wasn't asking for absolution. It wasn't positioning me to soothe her discomfort. It was offered without expectation. That mattered. We spoke for a while, about neutral things, about her garden, about a book she was reading. When we hung up, I felt calm, not healed, complete. Hannah sent a holiday card that year. No long message, no subtext, just a photo of a new place, a new job, a short note. Still figuring things out. I smiled. So was I. But the difference was, I was doing it without a shadow. At work, the ethics initiative began drawing attention. Other departments asked to adapt parts of it. External partners inquired quietly. I was careful about growth. I'd learned what happened when systems expanded faster than their values. Claire and I talked about that one night over dinner. You don't rush anything, she said. I used to, I replied. I just didn't call it rushing. I called it being flexible. She nodded. And now? Now I call it a choice, I said. In November, the firm held a leadership retreat. No family dynamics, no personal history, just professionals evaluating future direction. During one session, a senior executive asked, "What's the biggest risk we face moving forward?" People offered the usual answers: market volatility, regulation changes, talent retention. When it was my turn, I said something different. Complacency disguised as stability, I said. Systems fail when they stop questioning who they're built to serve. The room went quiet. Then, people nodded. Later, one of the younger managers pulled me aside. "I didn't know you could speak like that without consequences," she said. "You can," I replied. "Once you're not afraid of being removed from rooms you no longer need." That sentence stayed with me. As winter approached, my life felt grounded. Not static, not finished. Grounded. I spent Thanksgiving with Claire. No traditions inherited. No expectations. We cooked what we wanted, ate when we were hungry, talked when we felt like it. That felt like freedom. My family sent polite messages. Short, respectful. No pressure, no performance. I realized then that distance had done something unexpected. It hadn't destroyed the family. It had clarified it. Each relationship now existed on its own terms. And I finally trusted myself to maintain those terms. The night before my birthday, I sat alone for a while, reflecting, not on what I'd lost, on what I'd stopped carrying. The emotional labor, the unspoken responsibility, the role of stabilizer, translator, absorber, all of it had been quietly handed back. And the world hadn't collapsed. It had adjusted. The final chapter wasn't going to be about reconciliation or triumph. It was going to be about integration, about what happens when a woman stops being the silent center of everyone else's balance and becomes the author of her own. And that, I knew, was the real ending, even if the story kept going. The end doesn't announce itself. There's no ceremony for the moment you realize you're no longer defined by what you survived. It arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary day where nothing hurts more than it should. For me, it happened on a cold January morning, almost 4 years after the calendar invite that started everything. I was standing in line at a small bakery near my office, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, skimming emails without urgency. No family messages, no work emergencies, no tension waiting to be managed, just space. That was when it hit me. I wasn't bracing anymore. I hadn't realized how constant that had been. The internal posture of readiness. The assumption that calm was temporary. The belief that if I relaxed, something would fall apart and I'd be expected to fix it. Nothing fell apart. Instead, my life held. At work, the Ethics Initiative officially launched company-wide. It was no longer my project. It belonged to the system. Policies rewritten. Decision pathways clarified. Accountability distributed instead of concentrated. Exactly how I wished my family had worked. The board thanked me again, formally this time. There was talk of legacy, of long-term impact. I listened politely. Legacy, I'd learned, is not what people say after you leave. It's what no longer collapses because you were there. That afternoon, Claire and I met for lunch. She noticed something before I said a word. "You're lighter," she said. "I stopped carrying something," I replied. "What?" she asked. "The hope that people would eventually choose me if I proved enough," I said. "I already chose myself. Everything else is optional now." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. No commentary, no fixing. That was love without leverage. Later that week, my mother called. Her voice was calm, familiar in a way that no longer felt loaded. "I wanted to tell you," she said. "We finalized everything. The will, the estate plans. It's settled." "I'm glad," I replied. "There's a letter for you," she added. "Not legal, just personal. You don't have to read it." "Okay," I said. It arrived 2 days later. I didn't open it right away. When I did, it wasn't dramatic. No excuses. No attempts to rewrite history. Just acknowledgement of assumptions, of fear, of control mistaken for care. At the end, she wrote one sentence that mattered. "I see now that loving you should never have required you to disappear." I folded the letter and put it with my grandmother's. not as closure, but as context. The past didn't vanish. It simply lost authority. On my birthday, Claire surprised me with a weekend trip. No schedule, no plans, just movement. Air. Quiet. On the drive back, she asked one last question. If you could say one thing to the version of you before all this, what would it be? I didn't answer immediately. Then I said it. You don't need permission to stop negotiating your worth. That was the lesson. Not revenge. Not victory. Not watching anyone fail. My family didn't collapse. They didn't dramatically repent. They adjusted, imperfectly, to a world where I no longer buffered their choices. And I didn't become colder. The betrayal wasn't being excluded from property or plans. It was being taught that love required silence, endurance, and compliance. The revenge wasn't destruction. It was refusal. Refusal to explain myself endlessly. Refusal to carry unspoken burdens. Refusal to stay in systems that only worked if I stayed small. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, hear this clearly. You don't have to confront everyone. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to burn bridges to leave a place that never truly held you. Sometimes the most powerful move is signing the paper, closing the door, and building a life so grounded that no one else gets to decide your place in it ever again. If this story resonated with you, if it reflected something you've lived or are still untangling, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Not because you owe anyone engagement, but because choosing yourself is easier when you know you're not alone.